Hello, and welcome to the Silent Empires. If you're new here, please subscribe and like the video to support the channel. You can also support us by sending a super thanks on this video. Your support truly helps the channel grow. Now relax and enjoy the story.
Night falls over the northern coast of Sicily. The camera glides above a thin strip of land between sea and mountains, where an airport runway now cuts across former farmland. Cargo planes rise into the dark, their navigation lights blinking over the town of Sicily. In the 1,970 seconds, this landscape became a quiet transit point in a global trade that would flood cities thousands of kilometers away with illicit drugs. Investigators on 2 continents would come to believe that much of it could be traced back here, to a man whose name was barely known outside his region, Gaetano Badalamenti. In court documents and police reports, he would be described as a boss, as a central broker between powerful criminal organizations in Sicily and the United States. For local activists who tried to oppose him, he embodied a system that shaped daily life with fear and silence. How did a boy from a small agricultural town grow into one of the most influential figures in this underground world? To answer that, we have to go back to Sicily as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, long before jet aircraft and international trials, when the foundations of his life were laid in soil, poverty, and unwritten power. Gaetano Badalamenti was born on 14 September 1923 in Sicily, a municipality a short drive west of Palermo. At that time, Sicily was formally part of a unified Italy, but socially and economically it remained a world apart. Sicily's few thousand inhabitants lived among citrus groves, vineyards, and small plots of grain and vegetables. Ownership and control of this land were deeply unequal. Large estates were held by absentee landlords and managed by local intermediaries, while many families survived as tenant farmers or day laborers, working long hours with little security. It was a society in which formal state institutions were often distant or mistrusted, and informal power structures had long flourished. In this setting, the phenomenon that Italian officials and journalists increasingly referred to as the mafia had developed over decades as a loose network of local groups, each rooted in a particular town or rural district. Sicily was no exception. Police records from the early 20th century show that the area was already considered a stronghold of organized criminal influence, especially in matters related to land leases, citrus exports, and the movement of goods through Palermo's port. These groups did not exist in open defiance of society. Instead, they blended into it, relying on family ties, business relationships, and a reputation for being able to solve problems where the state was weak or ineffective. Children growing up in Sicily in the 1,920 seconds, including young Gaetano, would have taken this layered reality for granted. On one side, the institutions of the Italian state. On the other, powerful local figures who could open doors or close them, often without leaving a written trace. Little detailed documentation survives about the intimate details of Badalamenti's childhood, but available records and testimonies from later investigations allow historians to sketch the outlines. He was born into a farming family with roots in the area. Like many families in Sicily, the Badalamenti household lived off the land, their status somewhere between mere laborers and substantial landowners. This position was significant. Families in such a middle zone often depended on good relations, both with wealthier landlords above them and with poorer workers below them. In a context where influence and protection could be as valuable as money, relations with local criminal groups were often close, whether through kinship, long-standing friendships, or shared interests in keeping outside authorities at arm's length. Education in rural Sicily in the 1,920 seconds and 1,930 seconds was limited. While compulsory schooling existed on paper, the reality for many children in agricultural towns was that work on the family plot or in nearby fields took priority. Seasonal rhythms dictated life: sowing, pruning, harvest, and the labor-intensive maintenance of citrus trees and vineyards. It is likely that Gaetano, like most boys of his background, attended school only briefly before being drawn into this work. Even before adolescence, children were expected to contribute to the family's survival. In such an environment, the lessons that mattered most were not written in books but transmitted orally. How to judge the weather, how to negotiate with buyers, whom to trust and whom to avoid. Over all of this loomed the presence of the fascist regime. When Badalamenti was 3 years old, Benito Mussolini became Italy's prime minister. By the time he was 10, fascism had permeated institutions and daily life. Uniforms, flags, youth organizations, and slogans celebrating a strong, centralized state. In Sicily, however, Mussolini faced a particular challenge. The regime was determined to assert control over regions where local power networks had long undermined central authority. In the mid-1920s, the government dispatched Prefect Cesare Mori to Palermo with wide-ranging powers to combat the mafia. Mori's campaign combined mass arrests, raids on rural estates, and public trials. His methods were sweeping and did not distinguish sharply between hardened criminals and those merely suspected of association. The campaign disrupted existing balances in many towns, including communities like Sicily. For a child like Gaetano, these years would have been marked by a contradictory set of messages. Official propaganda depicted the state as omnipotent and benevolent, promising order and prosperity. Yet in daily life, families had to navigate a reality in which police operations could be unpredictable and sometimes brutal, and where informal networks still mediated access to work, loans, and protection. While Mori's crackdown did lead to the imprisonment or internal exile of many local figures, it did not eradicate the deeper social structures that had created the conditions for organized crime. Instead, it temporarily drove some activities deeper underground and made the management of loyalties and silence even more important. During the 1930 seconds, as Badalamenti entered adolescence, Sicily remained economically fragile. The world economic crisis had damaged export markets for citrus and wine, and fascist policies often favored industrial development in northern Italy over investment in the south. Emigration, which had previously served as a safety valve for rural desperation, was increasingly restricted by new immigration quotas in the Americas and by the regime's own desire to keep Italian labor at home. In towns like Sicily, this meant fewer opportunities to leave and fewer legal paths to upward mobility. Those who wished to advance beyond subsistence often needed some form of special access through politics, patronage, or the protection of powerful men who could open pathways to credit, contracts, or employment. These conditions were fertile ground for the persistence, and in some cases, the quiet regeneration of mafia groups, even under fascist surveillance. Local organizations played roles in arbitration of disputes, in controlling access to grazing land and water, and increasingly in managing contracts related to infrastructure or public works. As Gaetano came of age, the lesson that formal authority and real power were not always the same would have been impossible to ignore. In such an atmosphere, a young man with ambition and local connections could observe the advantages that came with being close to the shadow networks of influence, even if they were never openly discussed. The approach of war tightened the atmosphere further. By 1939, when Badalamenti was 16, Italy was aligning itself fully with Nazi Germany. The island of Sicily, strategically located in the central Mediterranean, was of obvious military importance. Conscription loomed over young men, and resources grew scarcer as the country prepared for conflict. Information about Gaetano's personal experience in these years is limited in public sources. Some accounts suggest he may have had periods of military service or other wartime obligations, but surviving documentation is fragmentary and does not allow for a precise reconstruction of his activities during the early 1940 seconds. What is clear is that, like all Sicilians of his generation, his late teens unfolded amid rationing, propaganda, and a gnawing uncertainty about the future. The war came directly to Sicily in 1943, when Allied forces launched a major invasion. The island became a battlefield. Military operations, bombing, and rapid political change shook the existing social order. The fascist regime collapsed, and with it, the centralized control that had attempted to curb local criminal networks. The Allied military government, suddenly responsible for administering a devastated and complex region, sometimes relied consciously or unconsciously on local intermediaries who were presented as community leaders or as people able to maintain order. In several Sicilian towns, men with past or present ties to organized crime obtained positions as mayors or important local figures in this transitional period. The exact role played by groups in Sicily at this moment is still the subject of historical research, but few doubt that local criminal organizations emerged from the war stronger than they had been at its peak. For young adults like Badalamenti, the collapse of fascism and the arrival of Allied troops opened a new era of uncertainty but also opportunity. The black market flourished as food and goods flowed from military stocks into unofficial channels. Smuggling and informal trade, always present, became central to survival for many families. It was in this chaotic context that a new generation of Sicilian organized crime figures learned to operate, mixing traditional control over land and labor with newer forms of illegal commerce. Although direct evidence of Gaetano's specific involvement in such activities in the immediate post-war years is sparse, later judicial investigations would portray him as a man who understood both the old rural codes and the possibilities of more modern, international criminal entreprise. Post-war Italian authorities, struggling to rebuild a shattered country and to establish stable democratic institutions, initially devoted limited attention to southern organized crime compared with more urgent political and economic crises. In Sicily, a tense political landscape unfolded. Large-scale peasant movements demanded land reform and challenged the old order of landowners and their intermediaries. At the same time, conservative political parties, especially the newly formed Christian Democracy, sought allies and brokers in local communities to secure votes and maintain stability. In this delicate balance, men who commanded respect and fear in their hometowns were valuable. Numerous historical studies have documented how, in several areas, elements of organized crime were able to insert themselves into this emerging political system, promising electoral support and order in exchange for tolerance or influence. Sicily, with its strategic location near the main road connecting Palermo to western Sicily, and later, with its proximity to what would become Palermo's international airport, was particularly well positioned for both traditional and new forms of illicit business. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, police and court documents in Italy began to mention Gaetano Badalamenti as a person of interest in investigations concerning the local mafia presence. These references, while often brief, indicate that by his late 20s, he was no longer just a young farmer in the background, but someone regarded by authorities as connected to the network of men of honor who dominated the Sicily area. Such designations were not given lightly. They reflected intelligence from informants, patterns observed in disputes and local politics, and the testimonies of those who, for one reason or another, had come into conflict with these networks. The transformation from a young man shaped by rural hardship and wartime turmoil into a recognized figure within organized crime was not the result of a single dramatic event, but of a gradual process embedded in the structures of his community. Access to land, control over work opportunities, mediation of conflicts, and the management of clandestine commerce all offered pathways for someone of Gaetano's background to rise. At the same time, such a rise implied deeper involvement in a system that depended on intimidation, collusion, and resistance to the rule of law. By the early 1950s, the outlines of the life that would make him notorious were coming into focus. He was emerging as an important intermediary in Sicily, a man whose name began to carry weight in conversations that never reached official records, even as his presence quietly entered the files of the state. From this point forward, the trajectory of his life would intersect not only with the history of his town, but with the broader evolution of the Sicilian mafia in the second half of the 20th century, its expansion into new markets, its clashes with both the Italian state and civil society, and its growing entanglement with international criminal networks. The seeds of that trajectory were planted in the world into which he was born, of poverty and hierarchy, of war and fragile institutions, of a community where formal authority and real power had long been at odds. In the years after the Second World War, Sicily entered a period of unstable peace. Bombed bridges were rebuilt, fields were cleared of unexploded shells, and new political parties tried to root themselves in parched soil. Yet beneath this slow reconstruction, older power structures were quietly reforming. Landowners, political brokers, and local criminal organizations all sought to redefine their roles in a changing Italy. It was in this fluid environment, between the late 1942 and early 1950s, that Gaetano Badalamenti shifted from being a name known only in Sicili's small farming circles to a man recognized by authorities as part of the island's re-emerging mafia. By the time he reached his late 20s, those who studied organized crime in the Palermo area were already encountering his surname in their files. Police reports from the early 1950s, later cited in parliamentary inquiries, describe him as a person of respect in Sicily, someone to whom others deferred in disputes over land, grazing rights, and local contracts. This language was a euphemism used by Italian officials who, lacking a specific offense to charge, nonetheless wanted to mark out those they believed were part of the clandestine structure of Cosa Nostra. The designation did not appear out of nowhere. In rural Sicily, influence accumulated through the careful management of favors, loyalties, and intimidation, and by this point, witnesses were already telling investigators that serious conflicts in Sicily tended to pass sooner or later through Badalamenti's hands. The countryside around Sicily was entering a period of transformation. For generations, the most valuable local resource had been citrus groves and arable land, controlled by landlords who rarely appeared in person, leaving day-to-day management to intermediaries deeply rooted in the community. After the war, demands for land reform shook this arrangement. Peasant cooperatives, often supported by left-wing parties, occupied estates and pressed for redistribution. Landowners, alarmed, turned to the traditional protectors of their interests, the local mafia groups that could discourage occupations and weaken peasant organizations. Figures like Badalamenti, who understood both the language of the fields and the new political alignments, were ideally placed to profit from this confrontation. Historical records do not allow us to pinpoint the exact moment when Badalamenti was formally initiated into the mafia. Initiation rituals were designed to leave no written trace, and membership was denied by those involved whenever they faced legal scrutiny. But testimonies from former mafiosi, who later became state witnesses, including Tommaso Buscetta, consistently place him among the men of honor of the Sicily family by the early 1950s and describe him as progressively emerging as its leading figure. In this role, his authority would have extended beyond purely criminal activity. He would have been expected to arbitrate disputes, represent the interests of his group in dealings with other towns, and manage the delicate relationships between illegal enterprise, local politics, and the formal economy. Italian authorities, still lacking specific laws against mafia association, relied on more general tools to limit the influence of such figures. One of these was soggiorno obbligato, compulsory residence orders that allowed officials to remove suspected mafiosi from their home territories and confine them to other regions under police supervision. Archival documents show that Badalamenti was subjected to such measures during the 1950s, a sign that by then he had firmly entered the radar of law enforcement. These orders, however, often had unintended consequences. Exiled to distant towns alongside other suspected criminals, men like him exchanged information, broadened their networks, and sometimes returned home with an even wider web of contacts than before. Meanwhile, Italy as a whole was beginning its economic miracle. Industrial growth in the north drew millions of workers from the south, while in Sicily, public money flowed into construction, roads, and new infrastructure. For the mafia, this shift presented enormous opportunities. Control of building permits, labor contracts, and transport offered new revenue streams that could complement or even surpass traditional rural rackets. Palermo, in particular, entered an infamous phase of speculative real estate development that journalists would later call the sack of Palermo, as green spaces and historic villas gave way to hastily built apartment blocks. Although Sicily was a smaller community, it too began to feel the impact of these changes, especially with plans for expanding transport infrastructure along the coast. One project would prove decisive for the town and for Badalamenti's later career: the development of what would become Palermo's main airport at Punta Raisi, just outside Sicily. Already in the 1950s, the idea of building a modern airport to serve Sicily's capital was circulating among planners and politicians. Such a project required expropriating large tracts of farmland and awarding lucrative construction contracts. In areas where the mafia was strong, public works of this kind rarely proceeded without its involvement. Landowners and tenant farmers facing expropriation often found that negotiations over compensation were influenced by local intermediaries whose real power derived not from any legal mandate but from their reputation and connections. Over time, investigators would come to see the control of land around Punta Raisi as one of the cornerstones of Badalamenti's local power. While his local influence was solidifying, international dynamics were changing the very nature of organized crime. Before the war, Sicilian groups had been linked to Italian-American criminal organizations through migration and family ties, but cooperation across the Atlantic remained sporadic. In the 1950s, as law enforcement in the United States increased pressure on domestic drug sources, attention turned to Europe and the Middle East as alternative suppliers. Sicily's geographic position, its existing smuggling traditions, and its network of contacts in immigrant communities in North and South America made it an attractive hub. According to judicial reconstructions and later testimony, by the mid-1950s, Badalamenti was among the Sicilian figures involved in strengthening these transatlantic ties. Relatives and associates from Sicily had emigrated, especially to the United States, where Italian-American mafia families controlled significant portions of the illicit market. Telephone records, travel documents, and bank traces examined much later by prosecutors would show recurring patterns of contact between him and individuals in American cities, particularly in environments already identified as controlled by organized crime. The details of their discussions were not recorded, but the broader context suggests that they revolved around commercial arrangements, dispute mediation, and the coordination of supply routes that spanned oceans. One symbolic turning point, often cited by historians, is a meeting held in 1957 at the Hotel de Palm in Palermo. There, prominent American mob figures met with leading Sicilian mafiosi to discuss future cooperation, including control of heroin trafficking. While some aspects of this gathering remain debated, multiple sources indicate that representatives from the Palermo area, among them men such as Salvatore, Chiascitedu, Greco, and according to various accounts, Gaetano Badalamenti, participated in talks that formalized a new level of partnership. The principle was simple but far-reaching. Sicilian groups would increasingly take on the role of importing and refining morphine base into heroin, then channeling it through trusted networks, including Italian-American crime families, into lucrative consumer markets. Within Sicily, these evolutions led to an internal reorganization. Under the influence of figures like Greco, the Palermoki area families revived and formalized a coordinating body often referred to as the Commission. This structure, which had earlier informal precedents, was designed to mediate conflicts, manage joint ventures, and provide a forum where disputes between families could be resolved without open warfare. Surviving police intelligence, corroborated by Pentiti decades later, places Badalamenti as the representative of the Sicily family on this commission. His position signaled that he was no longer simply a local boss, but part of the leadership circle guiding Cosa Nostra's adaptation to a new era. This elevated role brought both prestige inside the organization and closer scrutiny from the state. Italian law enforcement, alarmed by an uptick in sophisticated smuggling operations and unresolved homicides in the Palermo hinterland, intensified surveillance. Reports compiled in these years portray Badalamenti as a man who avoided ostentatious displays of wealth, consistent with a broader shift in mafia culture from rural men of respect, visible at markets and town squares, to more discreet figures operating behind legitimate fronts. Officially, he could present himself as an agricultural entrepreneur and businessman, engaged in citrus trading and land deals. Unofficially, investigators believe that he played a part in coordinating illicit shipments and ensuring that law enforcement remained at bay through corruption and intimidation. The intimidation itself remains largely invisible in the archives, surfacing mainly when someone decided, or was forced by circumstances, to speak. Farmers who refused to pay protection money or who complained about unfair expropriation terms sometimes found their livelihoods threatened or suffered property damage. Shopkeepers and small contractors who resisted demands for contributions occasionally reported being pressured or assaulted. Many more never denounced what they experienced, either because they feared reprisals or because they saw little point in appealing to institutions that seemed unable to protect them. In areas like Sicily, the silence surrounding such practices was part of how power maintained itself. Yet if the mafia's authority often went unchallenged in daily life, tensions were quietly building within its leadership. The expansion into narcotics, the distribution of profits from construction, and differing strategies about how openly to confront or infiltrate the state all created lines of friction. Chiefs from rural backgrounds sometimes clashed with those more rooted in urban business and politics. Younger mafiosi, impatient for rapid enrichment, had different priorities from older figures who favored a lower profile. From his position on the commission, Badalamenti had to navigate these internal disputes while preserving his own interests and those of Sicily. By the end of the 1950 seconds, the first signs of an impending storm were visible. Unexplained disappearances of mid-level mafiosi, bomb attacks in the Palermo area, and disputes over the control of contraband routes suggested that the mechanisms designed to prevent open conflict were under strain. The reconstituted commission held meetings to avert escalation, but its authority was not absolute. Some groups were willing to test how far they could push their rivals, betting that their strength or alliances would protect them from retaliation. For the moment, however, outward calm largely prevailed in Sicily. The airport project advanced, bringing surveying teams and early construction crews to lands that had been fields only a few years earlier. Badalamenti's position as a central mediator in the area remained firm, his name known to local authorities but still unfamiliar to the broader public. The full extent of his role, both in the emerging global drug trade and in the internal politics of Cosa Nostra, would only become clear later, when violence in Palermo finally forced Italian society to confront the system that had taken root around it, and when former insiders began to speak about the man from Sicily who had quietly helped shape its direction. At the beginning of the 1960 seconds, the fragile balance that had kept the Sicilian mafia's internal rivalries in check began to fracture. The organization had modernized, expanded its reach, and enriched itself through construction, smuggling, and growing involvement in the narcotics trade. Yet the very success of these ventures intensified the temptation to cut corners, to seize territory, and to bypass the rules that senior bosses believed were necessary to prevent chaos. For someone in Gaetano Badalamenti's position, head of the Sicily family and a representative on the provincial commission, these years were a test of his ability to navigate between personal interest, collective discipline, and the rising ambitions of younger, more aggressive figures. Tension coalesced around Palermo. On the one side were influential bosses such as Salvatore Siacitedu Greco and his relatives, whose power base stretched from the citrus groves of Sicily into urban construction and international smuggling. On the other side were the La Barbera brothers, who had rapidly climbed the ranks in the city's neighborhoods and were eager for a larger share of profits and influence. At the center of their dispute, according to subsequent investigations, lay both control of contraband routes and suspicion over missing quantities of narcotics in shipments that passed through Sicily on their way to foreign markets. The murder of Calcedonio di Pisa in December 1962 is widely regarded as the spark that set off open conflict. Di Pisa, involved in international trade and suspected by some peers of skimming from drug consignments, was shot down in Palermo. Almost immediately, accusations began to circulate within Cosa Nostra. One faction blamed the Grecos, another the La Barberas. Each side saw in the killing not just a single crime, but a move to undermine its credibility and economic position. The commission, designed precisely to prevent such feuds from spiraling, was called upon to investigate and arbitrate. In that forum, men like Badalamenti were expected to weigh evidence presented in secrecy, to listen to arguments framed in terms of honor and respect, but fundamentally rooted in money and power. Later testimonies by former mafiosi depict those meetings as tense, with participants acutely aware that any official attribution of blame could amount to a death sentence. According to multiple accounts, the commission eventually concluded that Di Pisa's murder had been orchestrated by the La Barberas, who were judged to have acted recklessly. Sanctions were supposedly imposed. Yet even as these decisions were taken, violence on the streets of Palermo was already escalating. Bombs detonated near the properties of rival bosses, killing bystanders and shaking working-class districts. Gun attacks targeted clan members and their allies. Fear spread through neighborhoods where, until then, many people had lived with the presence of the mafia as an unspoken but relatively predictable part of local order. Now that predictability crumbled. For the first time in years, ordinary residents saw open warfare between factions that claimed to embody a code of restraint. The commission, including representatives like Badalamenti, proved unable or unwilling to fully contain the conflict it had theoretically been created to prevent. The turning point came on 30 June 1963 inches, a rural area near Sicily, outside Palermo. A suspicious car, apparently abandoned, was reported to authorities. When bomb disposal specialists and members of the Carabinieri and fire brigade approached it, the vehicle exploded, killing 7 of them. The blast was not just a tragedy for the victims and their families. It was a political shockwave. For years, many Italian officials had treated the mafia as a localized problem, serious but manageable, and sometimes even useful in countering political unrest. The Sicily explosion made it impossible to maintain that attitude. For the first time in the post-war period, public opinion on a national scale demanded decisive action. The state's response was forceful. A wave of arrests swept across western Sicily. Houses were searched, safe houses raided, and suspected mafiosi, including long-established bosses, were rounded up. The commission, already weakened by internal tensions, effectively ceased to function. Among those targeted by investigators was Gaetano Badalamenti. His status as head of the Sicily family and as a participant in decision-making bodies made him a central figure in the eyes of law enforcement, even if there was no specific evidence linking him to the Sicily attack itself. Police dossiers from this period, later examined by parliamentary commissions, describe him as a notorious exponent of the criminal association in the Palermo hinterland. Witness statements pointed to his role in mediating disputes, organizing meetings, and overseeing the activities of his subordinates. While prosecutors often struggled to translate such intelligence into solid legal cases, mafia membership as such was not yet a distinct crime. Preventive detention and administrative measures were used extensively. For Badalamenti, this meant repeated periods in custody, and crucially, the imposition of compulsory residence orders far from his Sicilian base. Compulsory residence, or soggiorno obbligato, was intended to isolate suspected mafiosi from their networks. Men subject to these measures were required to live in designated towns, often in central or northern Italy, under regular police reporting. In practice, the effect was mixed. On the one hand, figures such as Badalamenti were indeed physically removed from their strongholds, disrupting local routines and creating temporary power vacuums. On the other hand, the concentration of experienced criminals in a limited number of distant locations created new opportunities for networking and planning. Those involved learned about new routes, new contacts, and new ways of disguising their activities under a veneer of legality. For a period in the mid-1960s, therefore, Badalamenti's life oscillated between confinement and tenuous freedom. When permitted, he returned to Sicily, where his authority had not disappeared. The structure of Cosa Nostra was resilient. Even in the absence of its leader, a family could continue to function through deputies, relatives, and trusted lieutenants. Land around Sicily remained under the influence of men loyal to him, and the evolving plans for the expansion of the Punta Raisi airport ensured that this land was of growing strategic value. Testimonies from later judicial proceedings would describe how compensation, construction contracts, and employment at the airport all became channels through which local mafiosi reinforced their control and rewarded allies. The broader context in Sicily during this decade was one of contradiction. On the surface, the state could point to achievements. The Sicily massacre had led to the first national anti-mafia parliamentary commission in 1963, a new focus on financial investigations and large trials against suspected mafiosi. Hundreds of indictments followed the crackdown, culminating in the so-called trial of the 114, held in Catanzaro and concluding in the late 1960s. Among the defendants were many key figures of Cosa Nostra, including bosses from the Palermo area. Gaetano Badalamenti was among those brought to face charges related to criminal association and involvement in mafia activities. The Catanzaro proceedings, however, exposed the limitations of the existing legal framework and the difficulties of breaking the wall of silence around Cosa Nostra. Witnesses were few, fearful, or inconsistent. Much of the prosecution's case rested on the attempt to prove the existence of a structured criminal organization at a time when Italian law had no specific offense for mafia membership and still struggled to conceptualize it as more than PIs. A series of individual conspiracies. Defense lawyers exploited every ambiguity, challenging the credibility of informers and emphasizing the lack of direct evidence tying their clients to specific crimes. In the end, many high-profile defendants were acquitted of the most serious charges or received relatively light sentences. This outcome was interpreted in various ways. Some saw it as a failure of the justice system, others as proof that the supposed omnipotence of the mafia had been exaggerated. Within Cosa Nostra itself, the verdicts were read as both a warning and an encouragement. A warning that the state was now willing to mount large, high-visibility trials, but an encouragement in the sense that, without structural reforms and robust witness protection, the organization could still count on secrecy and intimidation to shield its members. For Badalamenti personally, the Catanzaro trial and related proceedings did not end with a long prison term. He experienced periods of detention and surveillance, but ultimately re-emerged without a crippling judicial blow. This relative success further consolidated his standing inside the organization. A boss who had faced the full weight of a national crackdown, survived it, and returned to his territory with his authority intact, was someone to be respected. At the same time, the experience confirmed lessons already drawn from the post-Sicily years. Visibility attracted danger, and reliance on raw intimidation alone could provoke responses that threatened the entire system. Throughout the 1960 seconds, demographic changes in Sicily and the surrounding area also worked in his favor. Many young people left Sicily, drawn by work opportunities in northern Italy, Germany, or the United States. From Sicily, a notable stream of immigrants headed to North America, settling in cities where earlier migrants from western Sicily had already established communities. Some opened small businesses, grocery stores, bars, and especially pizzerias that provided a foothold in the local economy. Decades later, investigators would identify several of these establishments as important nodes in the wide distribution of narcotics. The diaspora thus became not only a social phenomenon but a potential infrastructure for future criminal enterprises. By the late 1960 seconds, the immediate shock of the First Mafia War and the Sicily massacre had faded, but its deeper consequences remained. The old equilibrium among Palermo's major clans had been shaken. Some bosses were dead or in exile. Others had seen their influence weakened. Younger figures, more attuned to the enormous profits available from international heroin trafficking, were pressing for a more aggressive strategy. In this transitional environment, men like Badalamenti experienced, connected both locally and abroad, and perceived as capable of negotiating between different factions were well positioned to shape the next phase. Meanwhile, the construction of the airport near Sicily was advancing. Runways, access roads, and service buildings rose on land that only a decade earlier had been largely agricultural. For local residents, The project brought mixed consequences. Some found new jobs. Others felt they had been inadequately compensated for expropriated land. For the mafia, the airport represented something more than just an economic opportunity. It was a gateway, a piece of infrastructure that could, in theory, facilitate the discreet movement of goods and people beyond the immediate scrutiny of customs and police. Later investigations would portray the control of this area as central to the logistics of drug trafficking and would consistently place Badalamenti at the center of that control. At the same time, the mood in parts of Sicilian society was slowly beginning to change. Intellectuals, priests, and local activists, disturbed by the entrenchment of criminal power and by collusion between politics and the mafia, started to raise their voices. In Palermo, figures like the sociologist Danilo Dolci organized public campaigns against poverty and lawlessness. In some rural communities, young people began to question the silence that surrounded intimidation and violence. In Sicily, this shift would eventually find expression in the activism of a younger generation that directly challenged the system over which Badalamenti presided. For the moment, however, these voices were still scattered and vulnerable, facing an entrenched network that had just emerged from one of its most serious confrontations with the state, more cohesive, in some respects, more determined than before. As the 1970 seconds approached, the Sicilian Mafia was preparing a new phase of organization. The Provincial Commission, which had effectively disintegrated under the pressure of the early 1960 seconds war and subsequent repression, would be revived in a modified form. Heroin trafficking, no longer a marginal sideline, was becoming a central pillar of revenue. The lessons of Sicily and Catanzaro about the dangers of indiscriminate violence and the weaknesses of state responses would inform how leaders like Gaetano Badalamenti chose to operate, at least for a time, in the shadows between local power and global crime. As the 1970 seconds opened, a kind of uneasy quiet settled over western Sicily. The explosions and ambushes of the early 1960 seconds had faded into memory. The cataclysm of Sicily had receded, replaced by the rhythms of construction sites, traffic, and television. Yet the organization that lay behind much of the region's hidden power had not disappeared. It had reorganized. The Sicilian Mafia, badly shaken by internal war and state repression, emerged from the decade's end leaner, more cautious and more focused than ever on business. In this reshaped landscape, Gaetano Badalamenti stood near the center of the web. By this time, he was firmly established as the head of the Sicily family. The land around the town, once a patchwork of citrus groves, small holdings, and pasture, now framed the new airport at Punta Raisi, opened in the mid-1960 seconds and gradually expanded. Expropriations for its runways and access roads had passed through the hands of local intermediaries, and among them, investigators consistently encountered the name of Badalamenti. Farmers who complained about low compensation or about being cut out of contracts or jobs connected to the airport often added in lowered voices that everyone knew who really decided how things went in Sicily. To the outside world, he remained barely visible, a man who presented himself as a businessman with agricultural and transport interests. To those inside the system, he was a recognized node of authority. Across the broader Palermo area, the mafia's leadership was trying to learn from recent history. The First Mafia War and the Sicily massacre had demonstrated the danger of uncontrolled violence. It not only spilled beyond the narrow circle of participants, killing uninvolved people, but it also provoked a level of state reaction that threatened the entire structure. In response, the organization's surviving bosses agreed to revive and refine the mechanism that had proven, in better times, to be its most important tool of internal discipline, the Commission. According to later testimonies by Pentiti, a new provincial coordinating body was reconstituted around the turn of the decade. Representatives from key mandamenti territorial districts around Palermo came together to discuss disputes, approve major actions, and oversee joint ventures. In these reconstructions, Badalamenti appears regularly as the representative for Sicily and the surrounding coastal zone, and as part of a small inner circle that, in practice, acted as the highest authority of Cosa Nostra in the province. Some witnesses would later describe him as a kind of chairman or mediator within this body, a man whose voice carried particular weight when it came to settling disagreements or deciding on delicate matters. Others emphasized that power in the commission was always collective and shifting, and that no single figure could dictate outcomes. What emerges clearly, however, is that by the early 1972, the man from Sicily had moved from the margins of national attention to the very heart of mafia decision-making, even if his name remained unknown to the general public. This institutional consolidation inside Cosa Nostra took place against a backdrop of mounting turmoil in Italy at large. The late 1962 and early 1972 were marked by labor conflicts, student protests, and the emergence of extremist groups on both the left and the right. Bombings and political violence, what would come to be known as the Years of Lead, absorbed much of the state's security focus. In this climate, police resources and public concern were increasingly directed toward terrorism. Organized crime, especially in the South, seemed to some politicians a secondary or even manageable issue, something that could be contained through periodic crackdowns and administrative measures. Rumors would later surface about tentative contacts between certain right-wing conspirators and mafia figures in this period, including during the aborted coup attempt led by Prince Junio Valerio Borghese in 1970. Some accounts suggested that emissaries had approached Cosa Nostra bosses, including those in the Palermo area, seeking assurance of neutrality or support in case of an authoritarian turn. The historical record here is fragmentary and often colored by political agendas. What can be said with confidence is that, in the climate of uncertainty, men like Badalamenti understood that their best strategy lay in discretion, avoiding entanglement in overt political conspiracies while quietly expanding their economic and criminal base under the cover of a state distracted by other emergencies. That base was increasingly centered on narcotics. The crackdown on the French Connection laboratories in Marseille and on traditional American suppliers had created a gap in the global heroin market. Sicily, with its existing smuggling routes, experience in contraband, and ties to immigrant communities abroad, was ideally placed to fill it. In the late 1962 and early 1972, investigators began to uncover small processing laboratories hidden in rural buildings in western Sicily, where morphine base imported from Turkey and the Middle East was refined into heroin. Seizures in Italy, France, and the United States showed a recurring pattern. Consignments traced back, directly or indirectly, to networks rooted in the Palermo district. In subsequent judicial proceedings, both in Italy and abroad, prosecutors would describe Gaetano Badalamenti as one of the key brokers in this emerging system. He was not the only one. Bosses like Stefano Bontate and members of powerful Palermo families were also central actors, but his position in Sicily, near an international airport and on the road between the capital and western Sicily, gave him a strategic advantage. Testimony from pentiti such as Tommaso Buscetta and Salvatore Contorno would later outline how he worked as an intermediary between suppliers, refiners, and overseas distributors, ensuring that profits were shared according to agreed rules and that disputes were brought before the commission rather than settled with reckless violence. On the other side of the Atlantic, parallel developments were unfolding. Italian-American mafia families, facing increased surveillance in traditional rackets like gambling and labor racketeering, saw in narcotics an opportunity that, while risky, promised enormous profits. A wave of Sicilian migrants in the post-war decades had opened hundreds of small businesses in the United States, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest. Many were ordinary enterprises run by law-abiding families. Others, however, provided convenient cover for criminal activity. Among these, pizzerias cash-based, able to import foodstuffs, and woven into the fabric of local neighborhoods proved especially useful. According to U.S. indictments and later court findings, networks based in cities such as New York and New Jersey began to import heroin through these establishments in the early 1970s, using Sicilian intermediaries to guarantee quality, timing, and reliability. DEA investigations would eventually label this web of trafficking and money laundering the pizza connection. At the Italian end, names like Badalamenti's surfaced in phone intercepts, surveillance reports, and testimonies as organizers and guarantors of these flows. Yet in the early and mid-1970s, much of this activity remained beyond the reach of law enforcement, which often only intercepted fragments of a larger, carefully compartmentalized system. Inside Sicily, the heroin business further increased the need for effective internal governance. Profits were vast, but so were the risks. A single intercepted shipment could lead to arrests and unravel carefully built channels. The Commission therefore continued to play a key role. It arbitrated over who could use which routes, how many laboratories could operate, who would manage them, and how the proceeds would be divided. In this context, witnesses later portrayed Badalamenti as favoring a relatively cautious approach. He is described as someone who valued stable, long-term arrangements and who understood that excessive violence or flamboyant displays of wealth could once again bring the full weight of the state down upon Cosa Nostra. If, inside the organization, he was regarded as a figure of experience and relative moderation, outside it, the social environment in his home territory was slowly changing in ways that would bring him new and unexpected opposition. Sicily in the 1970s was no longer the almost entirely rural community of his youth. The airport had altered its economy and its skyline, carving out a modern infrastructure that linked the town directly to national and international flows. New housing, small factories, and service businesses had sprung up. Young people were exposed not only to the traditional local culture, but also to television, universities, and political ideas from the broader world. One of those young people was Giuseppe Peppino Impastato, born in Sicily in 1948 into a family with connections to the local mafia environment. As a teenager and young adult, he broke sharply with that world, embracing left-wing politics and an openly anti-mafia stance that was highly unusual indeed, almost unheard of in a town so marked by silence and fear. By the early 1970s, he was organizing cultural circles, participating in protests against land expropriations for the airport, and denouncing what he saw as the collusion between local authorities, national politics, and the criminal networks that profited from public works. For a time, Impastato's activism remained on the margins of local life, more a curiosity than a direct threat. But as he and a small group of friends grew bolder, they began to name names. In leaflets, meetings, and eventually in satirical broadcasts on a small free radio station, they portrayed the figure of the local mafia boss as a symbol of everything they opposed. In these denunciations and parodies, the boss of Sicily was thinly veiled or not veiled at all. The taboo on pronouncing the names of powerful men in public was being broken. To a system built on respect, fear, and the careful avoidance of open confrontation, such behavior was profoundly destabilizing. For the moment, though, Cosa Nostra's main preoccupations lay elsewhere. Within the broader organization, a new axis of tension was developing, one that would ultimately prove fatal for the equilibrium in which men like Badalamenti had thrived. From the small inland town of Corleone, a group of mafiosi led first by Luciano Leggio, and then, increasingly, by Salvatore Totorina and Bernardo Provenzano was pressing for greater influence. These Corleonesi, as they came to be known, had long been considered rougher, more rural, and less politically connected than the established Palermo bosses. But their ambitions were considerable, and they were building alliances quietly with other dissatisfied or marginalized groups. After Leggio's arrest in 1974, this faction's ascent became more visible. According to Pentiti, a kind of restricted leadership group was formed within the commission, in which figures like Stefano Bontate, Gaetano Badalamenti, and Rina, ostensibly substituting for Leggio, coordinated major decisions. On paper, this arrangement was designed to ensure balance between urban and rural clans, between older elites and rising powers. In practice, it sowed the seeds of future conflict. Bontate and Badalamenti, with deep ties in Palermo's business and political circles, were seen by the Corleonesi as too prone to compromise with the outside world and too moderate in the use of violence. Riina and his allies, meanwhile, alarmed many traditional bosses with what they perceived as a ruthless, all-over-nothing mentality. Law enforcement in these years sensed that internal struggles were brewing, but concrete evidence remained scarce. Homicides associated with mafia disputes did occur, but they were often carefully targeted, carried out in ways that left few traces, and presented investigators with little more than corpses and silence. Public attention, moreover, drifted elsewhere, as Italy grappled with kidnappings by extremist groups, factory strikes, and political scandals. In the meantime, heroin shipments continued to cross oceans, money accumulated, and the influence of key Sicilian bosses extended into banking, real estate, and legitimate commerce, often through front men and shell companies. For Gaetano Badalamenti, the first half of the 1970 seconds thus represented a peak of power and influence. He was a central interlocutor between Sicily and overseas partners, a respected if not universally liked figure on the commission, and the uncontested arbiter of affairs in Sicily. He had also, through experience and instinct, internalized the lesson that survival depended on avoiding the kind of spectacular violence that had once provoked national outrage. But forces that did not share his caution were gathering strength, both within Cosa Nostra and in the new strands of civil society activism that were daring to challenge its hold on local life. The equilibrium he helped maintain was more fragile than it appeared, and events in the second half of the decade would show just how quickly it could unravel. By the middle of the 1970 seconds, the balance that had allowed the old Palermo bosses to coexist with the rising Corleone faction was already under strain. The heroin trade was bringing in money on a scale that few in Cosa Nostra could have imagined a decade earlier. With it came questions of control. Who would manage the laboratories? Who would oversee the shipping routes? Who would negotiate with American partners? And how the profits would be divided. For several years, figures like Gaetano Badalamenti, Stefano Bontate, and members of the Greco family managed to keep a precarious peace with the Corleonesi, represented by Salvatore Riina and his allies. But beneath the surface, distrust deepened. In later court testimony, former mafiosi would describe meetings of the commission in which these tensions surfaced. Badalamenti, by then in his 50s, was often portrayed as cautious and inclined toward compromise. He had built his influence on a mixture of rural authority in Sicily, business dealings, and relationships abroad. He understood that open warfare was bad for business and risked provoking another forceful reaction from the state. The Corleonesi, particularly Riina, were depicted as impatient with this approach. They accused the older bosses of keeping too much power and profit for themselves, of being too close to politicians and businessmen in Palermo, and of being unwilling to take the risks they believed were needed to secure dominance. At the same time, pressure on the Sicily boss was coming from a very different direction. In his hometown, the activism of Giuseppe Peppino Impastato was becoming harder to ignore. By 1976, Impastato and a circle of friends had founded a selfie-managed cultural center and later a small independent radio station, Radio 8, based in the nearby town of Terracini. From its modest studio, powered by borrowed equipment and volunteer labor, they broadcast music, commentary, and a biting satirical segment that targeted local corruption and mafia power. In those broadcasts, the figure of the Sicily boss was mocked openly under the nickname Tonno Seduto, a play on Sitting Bull. Listeners in the area understood exactly whom this referred to. The mockery was not just personal. Impastato's programs linked the expansion of the airport, the expropriation of land, and the distribution of public contracts to what he argued was a system of criminal control led by the local mafia family. He accused local officials of complicity or cowardice. He denounced the climate of fear that kept most residents silent. To challenge a powerful boss in such direct and public terms was extremely rare in Sicily at that time. For Cosa Nostra, which depended on a mixture of feared authority and a certain dark prestige, the The spectacle of a young man ridiculing one of its leaders over the airwaves raised disturbing questions about its ability to maintain control. According to later judicial findings, threats and warnings were issued. Friends and relatives urged Impastato to be more cautious, but he refused to moderate his tone. In 1978, he stood as a candidate in local elections for the small far-left party Democrazia Proletaria, campaigning door-to-door in Sicily, with leaflets that again denounced mafia influence and explicitly referred to the boss by name. He combined militant politics with an almost theatrical irreverence toward the figures who had long dominated his town. Where others lowered their voices or changed the subject, he raised his. On the night of 8-9 May 1978, Impastato was killed. His body, along with an explosive device, was found on a railway track near Sicily. In the chaotic hours that followed, as Italy was stunned by the discovery of the murdered statesman Aldo Moro in Rome on the same day, the local authorities quickly advanced the theory that the young activist had died while attempting an act of sabotage or terrorism. That version, for a time, entered the official record. The possibility that he had been the victim of a targeted mafia killing was not seriously pursued at first. For years, his family and friends fought to overturn that narrative. They insisted that he had been assassinated because of his public denunciations of the local boss and of Cosa Nostra more broadly. They founded a documentation center, preserved his broadcasts, and lobbied politicians and magistrates to reopen the case. Slowly, as Italian society's understanding of the mafia evolved and new investigative tools were developed, their efforts began to bear fruit. The testimonies of former mafiosi, combined with fresh examination of old evidence, led prosecutors to a different conclusion from the one originally advanced. Decades after the crime, courts would establish that the killing had been carried out on orders from the Sicily family. One local mafioso, Vito Palazzolo, was convicted as a direct participant in the murder. In 2002, after complex proceedings and in the light of new evidence and testimonies, an Italian court sentenced Gaetano Badalamenti in absentia to life imprisonment as the man who had ordered Impastato's death. The judges rejected the earlier hypothesis of an accidental explosion or terrorist act and formally recognized the murder as a mafia crime aimed at silencing an inconvenient voice. For many in Italy, this ruling became one of the defining elements of Badalamenti's public image, not only as a major trafficker and boss, but as the man held legally responsible for eliminating a young opponent who had dared to challenge his rule. While this local drama was unfolding, the internal balance of Cosa Nostra was tilting decisively. Around 1978, according to the later accounts of Pentiti, members of the commission allied with the Corleonesi moved against Badalamenti himself. He was accused within the organization of mismanaging funds and of acting independently in some heroin deals, charges that in the coded language of Cosa Nostra translated into a loss of trust. Behind these accusations, many historians see the hand of Riina, eager to eliminate or sideline a rival who still commanded considerable respect and who, crucially, opposed the idea of plunging the organization into a new war. The result was a formal decision to put him aside. In mafia terms, this meant stripping him of his role on the commission and effectively expelling him from the leadership, while stopping short, at that stage, of ordering his death. Such a move was extraordinary. It signaled both the growing boldness of the Corleonesi and the weakening grip of the traditional Palermo bosses who had until then dominated Cosa Nostra's direction. For Badalamenti, it meant that his position in Sicily had become untenable. In the months that followed, he left the island, establishing himself abroad, moving between various countries. Some sources point to extended stays in Brazil and Spain, where he sought to keep his international business interests alive, even as his home base slipped from his control. Back in Sicily, his removal was followed by events that confirmed the scale of the change underway. In 1981, the fragile peace within Cosa Nostra shattered. A series of rapid, brutal killings decapitated the old Palermo leadership. Stefano Bontate was ambushed and murdered in April. Salvatore Inzerillo, another major boss, was killed soon after, as were many of their allies. The Corleonesi and their coalition launched a systematic campaign against their rivals in what has come to be known as the Second Mafia War. The violence was widespread, and compared with previous conflicts, even less restrained. Relatives, suspected sympathizers, and potential avengers were also targeted. From his exile, Badalamenti watched as allies and former associates were eliminated or driven into hiding. Some analysts have argued that his earlier expulsion from the leadership, while initially a blow, may have spared him from sharing their fate. By the time the killings began, he was no longer physically present in Sicily, and in the internal logic of Cosa Nostra had already been politically neutralized. At the same time, he retained contacts and an aura of seniority that made him valuable in the eyes of those overseas partners who still saw him as a reliable interlocutor. He remained, however, a hunted man in another sense, the focus of growing attention from law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic. The Italian state's response to the Second Mafia War was far more determined than during earlier crises. Public opinion, shocked by the sheer number of murders and by the increasingly blatant infiltration of local institutions, demanded action. In Palermo, a group of magistrates, including Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino, formed what became known as the Anti-Mafia Pool, a coordinated team sharing information and strategies. They patiently assembled evidence, piecing together financial records, telephone intercepts, and the first substantial testimonies of higher-ranking defectors like Tommaso Buscetta and Salvatore Contorno. Buscetta's decision to collaborate with justice in 1984 was a turning point. A former member of Cosa Nostra, with deep connections on both sides of the Atlantic, he provided magistrates with a detailed description of the organization's structure, rituals, and leadership. He confirmed the existence and functioning of the commission and named many of its members past and present. Among the figures he identified was Gaetano Badalamenti, whom he depicted as an influential boss, especially in the 1970 seconds, with a central role in directing heroin trafficking. His testimony helped prosecutors move beyond the idea of the mafia as a loose constellation of local gangs, and instead present it as a unified criminal association with a chain of command crucial for the large trials they were preparing. At the same time, investigations in the United States were converging on a similar picture from a different angle. DEA agents, working with the FBI and local police, had been tracking heroin shipments arriving in American cities and noting recurring patterns. Distributors with Sicilian origins, contacts to small pizzerias and import businesses, and coded conversations with interlocutors in Italy and elsewhere. Wiretaps, undercover operations, and controlled deliveries gradually revealed an international network that prosecutors believed stretched from laboratories in rural Sicily to restaurants in New York, New Jersey, and the Midwest. In this context, the name of Badalamenti began to appear with increasing frequency in American investigative files. He was identified, on the basis of intercepted communications and informant reports, as a central broker able to guarantee large, regular supplies of heroin and to coordinate with various U.S.-based intermediaries. The scale of the operation and its connection to multiple mafia families led American authorities to plan an unprecedented joint trial that would bring together dozens of defendants under a single sweeping indictment. Before that could happen, however, they needed custody of key figures. In April 1984, Spanish police, acting on international arrest warrants, detained Gaetano Badalamenti near Madrid. He had been living under an assumed identity, but investigators had tracked his movements through surveillance and communications intercepts. Extradition proceedings followed, with both Italy and the United States seeking to put him on trial. Ultimately, Spanish authorities agreed to hand him over to the United States to face charges related to narcotics trafficking, conspiracy, and related financial crimes. His transfer to U.S. custody marked a dramatic shift in his circumstances. For decades, he had operated largely out of sight of the general public, his name known mainly to specialists in Italian law enforcement and to those around Sicily. Now he was to become one of the most prominent defendants in what American media would call the Pizza Connection case, a sprawling trial that aimed to expose the full architecture of the transatlantic heroin pipeline. While Italian magistrates in Palermo were preparing their own massive proceeding, the Maxi trial against hundreds of suspected mafiosi, including him in absentia, Badalamenti found himself in a New York courtroom, facing a different justice system but many of the same accusations. That he had turned his small Sicilian town and its strategic location into a crucial node in a global criminal enterprise that left a trail of addiction, corruption, and violence far beyond the fields where he had grown up. The courtroom in Lower Manhattan was a world away from the dusty roads of Sicily or the corridors of Palermo's courthouses. Fluorescent lights, English-language legal formulas, a jury of American citizens who had likely never heard of Sicily before the trial began. This was the stage on which, in the mid-1980s, U.S. authorities set out to tell a story that stretched from rural Sicily to inner-city neighborhoods in New York and beyond. At the defense table sat dozens of defendants, many of them of Sicilian origin. Among them, his hair now gray and his features heavier than in the old police photos from Italy, was Gaetano Badalamenti. The American case knit together years of surveillance, informant testimony, and drug seizures into a single narrative. Prosecutors alleged that, beginning in the early 1970s, a network of Sicilian and Italian-American criminals had organized the shipment of large quantities of heroin from Europe to the United States. Once there, the drugs were distributed through a decentralized system of intermediaries, some of whom used seemingly ordinary businesses, especially pizzerias, as fronts. It was this detail that led journalists to call the case the Pizza Connection. In the indictment, filed in 1984, U.S. prosecutors described Badalamenti as a central organizer and financier of the network, someone who could secure supplies from laboratories in Sicily and coordinate with trusted associates in Italy, the United States, and South America. They alleged that he had helped oversee the movement of heroin worth hundreds of millions of dollars, arranging for its delivery to American counterparts linked to established mafia families in New York and elsewhere. The charges were broad: conspiracy to distribute narcotics, importation, and related offenses such as using telephone and financial systems to further the scheme. The trial that followed was one of the longest criminal proceedings in U.S. history up to that point. Jury selection began in 1985, and the presentation of evidence, cross-examinations, and legal arguments stretched over some 17 months. Day after day, the court heard from law enforcement agents who had tailed suspects, intercepted calls, and seized shipments in ports and airports, from customs officials in various countries, and from cooperating witnesses who had themselves been part of the trafficking chain. These witnesses, many of them of Sicilian origin, pieced together details that surveillance alone could not provide. Some described how morphine base was imported to Sicily, refined into heroin in clandestine laboratories, and then dispatched in smaller parcels hidden in luggage, suitcases, or commercial shipments. Others testified about meetings in apartments, cafes, and back rooms of restaurants where, they said, men discussed quantities, prices, and payments while using coded language meant to confuse any eavesdroppers. Prosecutors played intercepted telephone calls in which speakers referred to shirts, suits, parcels, or pizza ovens, terms that, according to the government's interpretation and the witnesses' explanations, were shorthand for drug deliveries and payments. They presented notebooks and scraps of paper with figures and initials that, they argued, corresponded to quantities of heroin and to the shares owed to different participants in the scheme. On large boards, they displayed diagrams linking names, nicknames, and locations on both sides of the Atlantic, with lines converging on a handful of key organizers. One of those names, prominently positioned, was that of Gaetano Badalamenti. The defense sought to dismantle this construction. Lawyers argued that the government was relying too heavily on informants who had motives to lie, hoping to reduce their own punishment by incriminating others. They challenged interpretations of coded language, suggesting that references to merchandise and money were connected to legitimate trade citrus shipments, olive oil, or other goods often handled by Sicilian businessmen abroad. They emphasized that their clients, including Badalamenti, had not been arrested with drugs in their possession, and that much of the evidence linking them to specific shipments was circumstantial. For his part, Badalamenti maintained the line he had long adopted in Italy, that he was a businessman involved in agriculture and commerce, unfairly portrayed as a criminal leader because of his origins and associations. He denied supervising heroin trafficking, portraying himself as a victim of an overextended theory of conspiracy. Translators rendered questions and answers back and forth between Italian and English, while the jury tried to make sense of a world of hierarchies, codes, and unspoken rules very different from their own daily experience. Outside the courtroom, the case attracted considerable media attention. Articles in American newspapers explained to their readers who the Sicilian Mafia was, how it was structured, and why U.S. authorities considered the Pizza Connection trial a landmark in their efforts against international narcotics trafficking. Italian journalists, in turn, followed the proceedings as part of a broader story in which their own magistrates were finally gaining ground against Cosa Nostra at home. For the first time, a transatlantic public was being invited to see figures like Badalamenti, not as shadowy, almost mythical characters, but as defendants in a court of law, subject to questioning, evidence, and judgment. After months of testimony and legal argument, the government rested its case. The defense, having called far fewer witnesses, did the same. The jurors withdrew to deliberate, carrying with them thousands of pages of transcripts and exhibits. Their discussions stretched over days, then weeks. In March 1987, they returned to the courtroom with their verdicts. On the core narcotics conspiracy charges, they found Gaetano Badalamenti guilty. Several weeks later, at sentencing, the federal judge reviewed the gravity of the offenses, the scale of the alleged trafficking, and the defendant's role as portrayed at trial. Taking into account his age, he was now in his early 60s, but emphasizing the need for deterrence and the seriousness of the harm caused by heroin distribution in American communities, the court imposed a term of imprisonment that, in practical terms, amounted to the rest of his life. 45 years in federal prison, along with substantial financial penalties and an order to forfeit illicit gains. Appeals would follow, but the core outcome stood. In the United States, the man from Sicily was now formally branded, in the language of the law, as an organizer of a vast narcotics conspiracy. While he settled into the austere routines of a high-security federal penitentiary, count times, limited visits, correspondence monitored by the authorities, the other Sesti's major legal reckoning in his life was unfolding an ocean away. In Palermo, Italian magistrates had brought to trial 475 accused members of Cosa Nostra in what became known as the Maxi trial, held in a specially built bunker courtroom attached to the Usciardone prison. The proceedings began in February 1986, overlapping with the later phase of the Pizza Connection trial, and lasted until the end of 1987. The Maxi trial was the fruit of years of work by the anti-mafia pool led by judges like Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. Drawing on testimonies from Buscetta, Contorno, and other pentiti, as well as on massive amounts of documentary evidence, they presented the court with a structured picture of Cosa Nostra as a unified criminal association with its own internal rules, governing bodies, and hierarchy. For the first time, the Italian justice system treated the mafia not as a collection of isolated criminals, but as an organization in the full sense of the word. Among the defendants, many were in custody. Others were tried in absentia, including several high-ranking bosses who were either fugitives or, like Badalamenti, already imprisoned abroad. The charges against him in Palermo were broader than those he faced in New York. Italian prosecutors accused him not only of participating in drug trafficking and other illicit enterprises, but of being a member of the regional commission and of having had a role in decisions that led to numerous murders, especially in the years leading up to and including the Second Mafia War. New legal tools strengthened the state's hand. In 1982, after the assassination of the anti-mafia parliamentarian Pio La Torre and of the prefect Carlo Alberto dalla Chiesa, the Italian parliament had passed a law introducing the crime of associazione di tipo mafioso, mafia-type association, into the Penal Code as Article 416 UBIs. This allowed prosecutors to target the very fact of belonging to an organization that used intimidation, control of territory, and collusion with officials to pursue criminal aims. For someone like Badalamenti, whose role was less about personally carrying out acts of violence and more about directing and approving them, this change was crucial. In December 1987, the first instance verdicts of the Maxi trial were read out. The court recognized in strong and unequivocal language the existence of Cosa Nostra and the responsibility of its leaders for a long series of crimes. 19 bosses were sentenced to life imprisonment. Hundreds of others received long prison terms. Among those given life in absentia was Gaetano Badalamenti, convicted as a member of the commission and as a participant at the highest level in the criminal association's decisions and enterprises. It was, on paper, his second effective life sentence, handed down by two different countries for overlapping but distinct aspects of his activity. Appeals in Italy would drag on for several more years. But in January 1992, the Court of Cassation, the highest judicial authority, upheld most of the Maxi trial's key convictions, including those against the leadership. The decision was a watershed, confirming that even the most powerful mafia figures could be sentenced definitively on the basis of collective responsibility for the organization's actions. Legally, it also meant that the Italian life sentence against Badalamenti had become final. In theory, if he were ever released by U.S. authorities or returned to Italian soil, he would face immediate imprisonment there as well. During the late 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds, as these processes unfolded, the world around Cosa Nostra changed dramatically. In Sicily, the Corleonese leadership under Riina intensified its confrontation with the state, culminating in the bomb attacks of 1992 that killed Falcone and Borsellino, along with their police escorts. The public shock was immense. New laws were passed, prison regimes were toughened, and anti-mafia work became a central priority of the Italian state. A new generation of investigators and activists emerged, building on the work of those who had been assassinated. From his cell in the United States, far from Palermo's streets and Sicily's new civic movements, Badalamenti could only follow these developments through news reports and fragments of information that reached him by letter or in conversations with lawyers and occasional visitors. There is no record of him ever choosing to cooperate with either American or Italian authorities. He maintained his silence, adhering to the code he had lived by for decades, even as that code frayed under the pressures of long prison terms and changing loyalties among other mafiosi. Yet his name continued to surface in courtrooms in Italy. In the 1990 seconds, the case of Giuseppe Impastato was gradually reopened thanks to the persistence of the victim's family, local activists in Sicily, and a changing national awareness of mafia crimes. New evaluations of the original forensic evidence, combined with testimonies from pentiti, led investigators to discard the old theory of an accidental explosion or terrorist attack. Instead, they reconstructed the murder as a planned mafia operation. The judicial path was long, marked by procedural complications and delays. But in 2002, an Italian court in Palermo reached its final judgment on the case. It condemned Vito Palazzolo, a local mafioso, as a direct participant in the murder. It also sentenced, in absentia, Gaetano Badalamenti to life imprisonment as the mandante, the man who had ordered Impastato's killing in response to his persistent public denunciations. The court's reasoning emphasized not only the personal animosity that the broadcasts and political activity had generated, but also the perceived need, on the part of the local mafia, to reassert its authority in the face of a challenge that had broken long-standing taboos. By then, of course, the sentence was largely symbolic in practical terms. Badalamenti was nearly 80 years old and still serving his U.S. federal sentence. He would not be physically brought to Palermo's courtroom to hear the verdict, nor would Italy likely receive him before his death. But the ruling had broader significance. It acknowledged officially what activists and historians had long argued, that the murder of the young Sicily militant was a deliberate act of mafia repression, and that the boss who had once dominated the town bore legal responsibility for it. In American prisons, the routines of incarceration went on. Over the years, as is common with long-term inmates, Badalamenti was transferred between facilities, sometimes for security reasons, sometimes for medical care as age and illness took their toll. Accounts from those years are sparse. Unlike some other mafiosi who later wrote memoirs or gave extensive interviews, he left no detailed personal record. What is clear from official documents is that he remained under the strict conditions typical for inmates convicted of serious federal narcotics offenses, with limited privileges and little prospect of release. Legal debates occasionally arose over whether he should be extradited to Italy after completing his American sentence, or whether some form of coordination between the two countries' sentences could be found. Given the length of the U.S. term and his age, these discussions were largely theoretical. Human rights norms, including concerns about duplicative punishments and his health, also played a role in tempering calls for a strict, sequential enforcement of both life sentences. In practice, his world had narrowed permanently to the walls of the institutions in which he was held. Meanwhile, in Sicily, his absence became part of a broader transformation. Anti-mafia groups organized public events. Schools took students to visit the places associated with Impastado's life and death, and the once untouchable boss's former house was eventually confiscated and, after years of legal and administrative wrangling, slated for social use. The narrative had shifted. Where once silence and fear had surrounded his name, now he was increasingly presented, in books, films, and civic education, as an emblem of a past that Sicily was struggling to overcome. In this way, even as his physical capacity to act diminished in the confines of distant prisons, the consequences of the choices he had made across decades in Sicili's fields, in the backrooms of Palermo, in the logistics of international trafficking continued to shape lives and memories on both sides of the Atlantic. The law had finally caught up with him in courtrooms in New York and Palermo, but the social reckoning with the system he represented, and with the damage it had done, was still unfolding, carried forward by people who had grown up in the shadow of his power, and were determined that future generations would not have to do the same. The years after his American conviction stretched out in a long, monotonous sequence of days behind bars. For a man who had once moved across continents, weighed in on disputes that shaped the direction of Cosa Nostra, and controlled a key piece of territory overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea, the physical boundaries of a U.S. federal prison were a stark reduction. Count times, institutional food, regulated phone calls, and brief visits from lawyers replaced the discreet meetings in farmhouses, the quiet conversations in Sicili's streets, and the long, coded telephone calls to New York and São Paulo. There is little detailed public documentation about his daily routine in those years. U.S. prison records are not written with biography in mind. What is clear is that, as an inmate convicted of large-scale narcotics trafficking and identified by Italian and American authorities as a high-ranking mafia figure, he was held under conditions appropriate to a serious federal offender. He had access to legal counsel, correspondence, and limited interaction with other prisoners. But the sphere of his influence narrowed steadily. Orders and messages that once traveled effortlessly across borders now had to pass through a thick filter of surveillance, and over time, even those who might once have sought his advice or authorization found other patrons or other paths. Outside, the world he had helped shape was undergoing a profound upheaval. In Sicily, the Corleonese leadership, which had already launched its campaign to dominate Cosa Nostra, escalated its confrontation with the state. The assassinations of General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa in 1982, of politicians and police officials in the following years, and then, most shockingly, of judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino in 1992, marked a grim climax. The bombings on the highway near Capaci and in Via D'Amelio in Palermo not only killed the magistrates and their escorts, but also tore open the public's understanding of what the mafia was prepared to do to protect itself. Those attacks triggered a level of reaction that went beyond anything seen in Italy's previous confrontations with organized crime. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in spontaneous demonstrations. Parliament passed new emergency laws strengthening witness protection programs, tightening the harsh prison regime known as 41 avibis for mafia inmates, and expanding the tools available to investigators. The state poured resources into anti-mafia efforts. Civil society groups, schools, and associations began to make the fight against Cosa Nostra a central theme of civic education. From a cell thousands of kilometers away, Gaetano Badalamenti could only watch, through the narrow lens of newspapers and occasional television news, as this drama unfolded. He was no longer in a position to influence strategy or mediate among factions. The organization whose commission he had once sat on was being reshaped by new forces and responding to a different kind of pressure. In interviews in court, testimonies from this period, Pentiti, who had known him, spoke of him almost in the past tense, even while he was still alive. A representative of an earlier phase, powerful in his time, now eclipsed by those willing to embark on a strategy of confrontation with the state that he had tried to avoid. Yet his name did not disappear from legal documents. On the contrary, as prosecutors in Italy revisited earlier crimes and reopened cold cases with the help of new collaborators, they repeatedly encountered episodes in which his role had been alleged or suggested. The murder of Giuseppe Impastato, long filed away in official records under a misleading narrative, was one of these. The persistence of Impastato's mother, Felicia, his brother Giovanni, and their allies in keeping the memory of his denunciations alive, combined with a new generation of magistrates more attuned to the methods of Cosa Nostra, gradually shifted the judicial perspective. Pentiti, who had belonged to the broader Palermo circuit, began to confirm what local activists had always claimed, that the young militant's killing had been a mafia operation, ordered because his public ridicule and denunciations of the Sicily boss were seen as intolerable. These testimonies, combined with a critical re-examination of the forensic evidence and the contradictions in the original inquiry, led to formal charges against those believed to have carried out the murder and those said to have ordered it. By the time the case reached a conclusive verdict in 2002, the man allegedly behind the decision was nearly 80 years old and long detained abroad. Still, the court named him clearly Gaetano Badalamenti, former boss of Sicily. Long before that sentencing, however, his legal status had been shaped by another landmark decision, the final confirmation of the Maxi trial verdicts in 1992. In that ruling, the Italian Court of Cassation upheld his life sentence for mafia association and related crimes as a member of the commission. Combined with the earlier U.S. sentence of 45 years, this meant that, in two separate jurisdictions, he was now definitively branded at the highest level of criminal responsibility. There would be appeals on procedural points and occasional legal motions, but the basic picture was set. Whatever might be argued about specific episodes, courts in both Italy and the United States had concluded that he had spent decades at the apex of an organization built on systematic law-breaking, intimidation, and a profound disregard for the lives damaged or destroyed along the way. Despite this, he never chose to cooperate with either justice system. As far as public records show, he did not follow the path taken by other high-ranking mafiosi who, faced with life sentences and the collapse of their world, began to provide detailed accounts of meetings, structure, and crimes in exchange for reduced penalties and protection. His silence was interpreted by some as a final act of loyalty to the old code of omerta, by others as a calculation that, at his age and under his legal burdens, collaboration would change little for him personally, while endangering relatives and past associates. Whatever the motivation, it meant that historians, magistrates, and the public would never hear his own version of the choices he had made, beyond the blanket denials of criminal intent repeated over the years through lawyers' statements and occasional declarations in court. If his voice was absent, the testimony of others increasingly filled in the contours of his story. Buscetta, Contorno, and later Pentiti described him as measured but firm, a man who preferred negotiation to reckless bloodshed, but who did not hesitate to authorize killings when he deemed them necessary for maintaining control. They emphasized his central role during the rise of the heroin trade, his influence over Sicily and the area around Punta Raisi Airport, and his seat on the commission. Their accounts varied in detail and emphasis, occasionally contradicting each other, but on the broad strokes they converged. He had been, for a crucial period, one of Cosa Nostra's principal decision-makers. At the same time, social narratives about him were taking shape in a very different register. In Sicily and across Italy, books, plays, and films began to recount the life and death of Peppino Impastato. In those stories, the figure of the local mafia boss appeared as a looming presence, alternately invisible and threatening, representing a system of power that Impastato had defied. Authors and directors, drawing on court documents, journalistic investigations, and interviews with contemporaries, portrayed Badalamenti not as a romantic outlaw, but as a symbol of entrenched privilege grounded in violence and fear. The tension between these two ways of remembering judicial and cultural gave his name a new resonance. Where once it had been spoken in hushed tones in Sicily streets, now it appeared in newspaper headlines, school textbooks, and anti-mafia materials as an example of the kind of figure against whom a democratic society must constantly guard itself. The confiscation and repurposing of assets linked to Cosa Nostra, made possible by reforms in Italian law, extended this symbolic reversal to physical spaces. Properties attributed to him and to his family network became targets for seizure. Some were eventually transferred to social cooperatives or public institutions, part of a broader effort to turn the fruits of criminal power into resources for the common good. His personal world, meanwhile, contracted further with age. Federal Bureau of Prisons records indicate that, as he grew older and his health declined, he was transferred to facilities equipped to handle chronic illness. In his final years, he was held at the Federal Medical Center in Devens, Massachusetts, a facility that combines medical care with the security measures typical of the U.S. prison system. There, among inmates with a wide range of conditions and convictions, he spent his last days far from the Mediterranean climate of his birthplace. On 29 April 2004, at the age of 80, Gaetano Badalamenti died in that medical center. The cause was reported as complications linked to illness and advanced age. His passing attracted far less international media attention than his trials had. A few Italian newspapers noted the death of the boss of Sicily and recalled the key stages of his career: his alleged role in heroin trafficking, his place on the commission, his association with the airport territory, the American sentence for the pizza connection, the Italian life sentences in the Maxi trial, and the Impastato case. In Sicily, the reaction was muted. There were no large public displays of mourning. The climate by then was very different from the decades when mafia funerals were occasions to demonstrate local power. Yet even in death, certain practical questions lingered. Formally, he remained a convicted life prisoner in Italy, his sentence never having been served on Italian soil. Extradition, long discussed in theory, was rendered moot by the simple biological fact that his life had ended in American custody. For the Italian justice system, his death closed one chapter, but did not annul the significance of the judgments rendered against him. For anti-mafia activists and historians, it removed the possibility, always remote, but never entirely absent, that he might one day choose to speak. The end of his life thus underscored a paradox that runs through much of the history of Cosa Nostra. On one hand, the individual boss, however powerful, is ultimately mortal. Arrests, trials, exile, and death have removed one leader after another over the decades. On the other hand, the structures, habits, and networks that allowed figures like Badalamenti to emerge do not vanish automatically with their passing. They must be dismantled piece by piece through law enforcement, judicial rigor, economic reform, and cultural change. In the years since 2004, that work has continued. Further trials in Italy have illuminated additional aspects of the period in which he was active, from political collusion to internal mafia strategies. Archival releases and declassified documents have allowed scholars to refine their understanding of the interplay between organized crime, state institutions, and international markets. New pentiti have added their voices, sometimes revisiting events in which he played a role. The portrait of him, as of Cosa Nostra as a whole, has become more detailed, less dominated by legend, and more grounded in verifiable fact. At the same time, Sicily and Sicily have evolved. Streets that once felt to many under the watchful gaze of a few untouchable men are now sites of school visits. Murals and plaques commemorate those who opposed the mafia rather than those who served it. Public marches on the anniversaries of key murders, including that of Impastato, highlight the distance traveled since the days when such crimes could be dismissed as accidents or private matters. While no one pretends that organized crime has vanished from the island, the social environment that once allowed someone like Badalamenti to operate with near-total impunity has changed in important ways. From the vantage point of history, his trajectory appears at once exceptional and characteristic. Exceptional, because not every local boss from a small Sicilian town rose to such a central position in a global criminal network, or ended his days in a foreign prison after being sentenced by courts on 2 continents. Characteristic, because the path he followed rooted in land, family ties, the exploitation of weak institutions, and the lure of illegal markets mirrored, in concentrated form, the broader story of the Sicilian mafia in the second half of the 20th century. His life, now fully enclosed between 2 dates, invites questions that go beyond individual guilt or responsibility. How did a rural society produce a system in which someone like him could wield so much hidden power? Why did institutions take so long to respond effectively? What combination of legal innovation, civic courage, and international cooperation was finally required to bring him to account? And what can that experience teach about confronting similar phenomena elsewhere? Those are questions that continue to animate historians, jurists, and citizens who see in the story of Sicili's most notorious son not just a closed chapter, but a case study in the long, difficult struggle to build a society in which the rule of law and the dignity of ordinary people are not perpetually overshadowed by the influence of men who operate in the shadows. On a clear spring morning, the town of Sicily looks, at first glance, like many other small places along the Sicilian coast. Laundry hangs from balconies, children hurry to school, and beyond the rooftops the runway of the Falcone Borsellino airport stretches toward the sea. Planes rise and descend with a regularity that has long since stopped attracting the attention of locals. Only when the camera lingers does the layered history of this landscape begin to emerge. The line of the railway, where Giuseppe Impastato's body was found. The streets that once led from modest houses to the office of a man everyone knew but few dared to name. The confiscated villa that now hosts cultural events and anti-mafia meetings. At the center of these overlapping stories stands still the figure of Gaetano Badalamenti. In the years since his death in a distant American prison, the work of understanding and explaining what he represented has intensified rather than faded. Magistrates, historians, journalists, and activists have sifted through court records, police reports, parliamentary inquiries, and the testimonies of former mafiosi to reconstruct not only his individual trajectory but the wider system that it illuminates. Where older narratives might have cast bosses like him as almost mythical villains or as crude stereotypes, the more nuanced picture that has emerged is of a man both shaped by and shaper of a particular social and political environment. One of the striking aspects of this environment is how small and local its physical stage appears compared to the scale of its consequences. The territory that constituted the heart of his power base, the town of Sicily, parts of the neighboring coast, the land around the airport covers only a few square kilometers. Yet decisions taken there, in quiet meetings and unrecorded conversations, had repercussions that rippled outward across continents. Heroin refined in hidden laboratories in western Sicily traveled, via routes he helped oversee or guarantee, to American cities where it fueled addiction, violence, and urban decay. At the same time, orders given to eliminate a troublesome activist in Sicily reverberated decades later in international human rights debates and in the curricula of Italian schools. The legal tools that eventually brought Badalamenti to judgment were themselves products of a long and difficult evolution. When he first appeared in police reports in the 1950 seconds, Italian law had no specific category for mafia association. Investigators could arrest him for illegal possession of weapons, for obstructing justice, perhaps for individual acts of extortion or violence if witnesses dared testify. But the idea of prosecuting him simply for being part of Cosa Nostra, for participating in a criminal association with its own rules and hierarchy, did not yet exist. That gap allowed many bosses of his generation to operate in a gray zone where everyone knew their status, but few legal consequences followed. It was only in 1982, after the assassination of Pio La Torre and General Dalla Chiesa, that Article 416 bis entered the Italian Penal Code, recognizing mafia-type association as a crime in itself. That law, often called the Rognoni La Torre law, drew on years of experience and failures in dealing with Cosa Nostra. It formalized what magistrates like Falcone were already arguing, that the mafia was not merely a sum of individual criminals, but an organization that used intimidation and silent social consent to control territory and influence economic and political life. For someone like Badalamenti, whose power lay as much in representing Sicily in the commission and brokering deals as in any personal act of violence, the new law was decisive. It allowed courts in the Maxi trial to hold him accountable for his position within the structure, even when direct proof of his hand in particular murders was limited. Closely linked to this legal innovation was another tool that would fundamentally reshape the battle against figures like him: the confiscation and social reuse of assets. For decades, the wealth accumulated by mafia bosses, often reinvested in land, villas, businesses, and financial instruments, remained largely out of public reach even when individuals were convicted. Beginning in the 1980 seconds and gathering strength in the 1990 seconds, reforms made it possible not only to seize property linked to criminal activity, but to assign it to community organizations, cooperatives, and public bodies. In Sicily, this process took on a particularly charged symbolic meaning. Properties associated with the Badalamenti clan buildings that once embodied its prestige and dominance were gradually targeted for confiscation. After long legal battles and administrative delays, some of these spaces began to host cultural events, educational workshops, and meetings of anti-mafia associations. The transformation was concrete and visible. Where once decisions had been made about how to divide up contracts, manage trafficking routes, or respond to dissent, now school children gathered to watch films about the mafia's history, or to listen to survivors of intimidation talk about their choices. This symbolic reversal was mirrored in the way local memory of him shifted. For many years, older residents of Sicily spoke of the boss with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, recalling his capacity to resolve problems or keep certain forms of street crime under control, even as they avoided direct criticism. The killing of Impastato, initially misrepresented in official narratives, was discussed only in private or among those already convinced of the mafia's role. Over time, as court sentences clarified responsibilities and as civic initiatives multiplied, that balance changed. Testimonies collected in documentaries and oral history projects show younger generations using his name without the hesitation that marked their grandparents' stories, placing it in a context of condemnation rather than awe. Beyond Sicily, the legal saga surrounding him contributed to the development of international cooperation against organized crime. The Pizza Connection investigation and trial, which brought him into the dock in New York, were early examples of coordinated efforts between U.S. agencies and foreign counterparts to tackle transnational trafficking networks. Italian investigative work fed into American cases. American wiretaps and seizures, in turn, provided evidence for Italian prosecutors building files on Cosa Nostra's global operations. These experiences highlighted both the possibilities and the limitations of cross-border justice at a time when such cooperation was still relatively new. By the late 1990 seconds and early 2000s, lessons drawn from the pursuit of figures like Badalamenti informed broader international frameworks. In 2000, the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime was opened for signature in Palermo, a choice heavy with symbolism. The Palermo Convention, as it became known, called on states to criminalize participation in organized criminal groups, to adopt measures against money laundering, and to strengthen mutual legal assistance. Among the examples often cited in discussions around the convention were the mafia structures in Italy and the response that had slowly been built to confront them. In a sense, the path that led a boss from Sicily to a New York courtroom and to multiple life sentences became part of a global reference point for how states might address similar challenges elsewhere. Historians analyzing his role have emphasized that his story contradicts some of the more simplistic myths about the mafia. He was not a flamboyant gangster in the cinematic mold, nor a mastermind commanding from an ivory tower. His power flowed from a dense web of relationships with landowners, local officials, international traffickers, and other mafiosi, and from his ability to move between registers, rustic familiarity in Sicili's bars, coded politeness in Palermo's salons, business-like pragmatism in meetings with overseas partners. He embodied a type of boss who understood that lasting control depended as much on managing appearances and negotiations as on force. At the same time, the harm linked to his activities was anything but subtle. The heroin trade he helped coordinate contributed to human suffering on a vast scale. Overdose deaths, family breakdown, the entrenchment of urban criminal economies in U.S. and European cities. The local system he dominated in Sicily relied on intimidation that might not always have left visible scars but shaped daily choices: what jobs people could accept, which contracts they might win or lose, what topics could be safely discussed in public. And the decision to eliminate a dissident voice like Impastato sent a chilling message to anyone tempted to speak out. For researchers trying to understand why someone like him could reach such a position, economic and political factors are impossible to ignore. Post-war Sicily, with its combination of poverty, land inequality, slow state presence, and rapid but uneven modernization, provided fertile ground for an organization that could offer protection, access to credit, and a sense of belonging at a price. Political parties, especially in the center and right, often relied on local intermediaries to mobilize votes and maintain order. Too often, those intermediaries had one foot in the legal world and one in Cosa Nostra. In this gray area, men like Badalamenti could flourish, turning the unofficial services they provided into ever more formalized power, backed by networks of silence and fear. The long-term confrontation between the state and Cosa Nostra, in which his case is one chapter, also reveals how slow institutional change can be when facing deeply rooted illegality. Only after repeated crises, the Sicily massacre, the First Mafia War, the killing of judges, the Second Mafia War's massacres of the early 1982s, and the bombings of 1992 did Italy develop a coherent, durable strategy. Even then, advances were often followed by setbacks. Brave magistrates and police officers paid with their lives. Political will waxed and waned. That it took decades for the system to catch up with someone as exposed in certain respects as Badalamenti underlines how resilient such structures can be when protected by collusion, fear, and inertia. Yet the very fact that he was ultimately convicted, in both Italy and the United States, marks a significant shift. Where earlier generations of bosses died peacefully at home, rarely troubled by serious legal consequences, his last 2 decades were spent under lock and key, his movements and communications monitored, his wealth targeted. The image of him sitting, not in a smoky backroom in Sicily, but in a U.S. courtroom listening to a foreign judge pronounce a 45-year sentence, symbolizes a reversal of fortune that would have been difficult to imagine when he was a young man building his reputation after the war. The question remains, what does his story teach about preventing future Badalamentis? One lesson is that repression alone, however necessary, is not sufficient. Police operations and court sentences can remove individuals and disrupt networks. But if the social and economic conditions that allowed them to rise remain unchanged, new aspirants will step into the gap. In Sicily, efforts to strengthen education, diversify the economy, and reinforce transparent public administration have been crucial complements to legal crackdowns. The transformation of confiscated mafia assets into social resources, the spread of anti-mafia education in schools, and the support given to businesses that refuse to pay protection are all part of this broader strategy. Another lesson is the centrality of information and testimony. For decades, Omerta protected men like Badalamenti from exposure. The emergence of pentiti willing to describe internal structures broke this wall. So did the rise of independent media and grassroots organizations capable of challenging official narratives, as in the fight to reclassify Impastado's death as a mafia murder. Without such voices from within and from below, the state's efforts would have remained partial and vulnerable to distortion. Finally, his case underscores the importance of looking beyond stereotypes when analyzing organized crime. The image of the mafioso as a purely local, almost folkloric figure obscures the reality of transnational connections and sophisticated financial operations. Conversely, focusing solely on international trafficking can lead to neglect of the local mechanisms of control land, construction, small businesses on which such figures build their base. To understand someone like the former boss of Sicily is to see how these levels interact. The village bar and the New York restaurant, the council office and the international bank transfer, the whispered threat and the coded long-distance phone call. Today, as the camera pulls back from Sicily's streets and the airport's runway comes into full view, the town appears at peace. Planes take off bearing tourists, and business travelers who may know the airport's name, Falcone and Borsellino, but not the details of the battles that led to that dedication. On a wall near the railway, a mural shows the smiling face of Peppino Impastato, alongside slogans about freedom from fear. In community centers and classrooms, his story is told as that of someone who chose to oppose the system embodied by men like Gaetano Badalamenti and paid with his life, but whose example helped inspire a different future. The man who once made others lower their voices when they spoke of him no longer walks these streets. His house is no longer a symbol of untouchable authority, but a site of public memory. Court files bearing his name sit in archives in Palermo and Rome, consulted by researchers and students trying to understand a complex past. The honor he cultivated within Cosa Nostra has been replaced, in the wider society, by a very different judgment, that of a citizenry and a legal system which, after many delays and failures, ultimately recognized the full weight of the harm he helped cause. In tracing his path from the child of rural Sicily to an international trafficker sentenced in New York and condemned in Palermo, we are reminded that history is not only the story of victims and heroes, but also of those who built and sustained destructive systems. To look closely at his life is not to glorify it, but to strip away the mystique that once surrounded such figures and to see, in detail, how they operated and how they were finally confronted. It is above all to underline that the quiet complicities and loud silences that once made his power possible are not inevitable. They are choices. And as Sicily's present shows, different choices can, over time, reshape even the places most marked by his shadow. The story of Gaetano Badalamenti does not end with a single dramatic scene, a last stand, or a late confession. It ends, rather, with a long fade. The gradual erosion of his influence, the slow tightening of judicial nets, the inevitable decline of age inside foreign prison walls. That very lack of spectacle in his final years is instructive. For decades he embodied a form of power that thrived precisely because it avoided open confrontation, preferring negotiation, quiet coercion, and the shadowy management of flows of money, of goods, of favors. When that power finally met sustained, coordinated resistance from states, magistrates, and citizens, it did not explode. It withered. Looking back across the arc of his life, a pattern emerges that is larger than the individual. Born into a rural society marked by poverty and hierarchy, he moved early into the world of protection, mediation, and clandestine authority that we now call Cosa Nostra. He learned to manage land deals, work opportunities, and access to public contracts in and around Sicily. As international markets for narcotics expanded, he was among those who recognized how Sicily's location and diaspora networks could turn local influence into global profit. For a time, he helped orchestrate one of the most significant heroin pipelines in the world, connecting farmhouse meetings and airport runways in Sicily to street-level transactions in American cities. Yet the same globalization that allowed him to expand his reach also enabled his eventual downfall. The movements of money and drugs that once slipped almost unnoticed across borders began to leave traces in bank records, in customs reports, in telephone switches. Cooperation between police forces and magistrates, at first limited and uneven, gathered momentum. The investigations that led to the Pizza Connection trial and the Maxi trial were possible only because authorities in different countries shared information and overcame institutional habits of secrecy and competition. In that sense, the path that carried him from Sicily to a New York courtroom and ultimately to a medical ward in a U.S. prison is as much a story of institutional learning as of individual wrongdoing. His case also underlines the importance of time in the struggle against entrenched criminal systems. For many years, he appeared almost untouchable. Preventive measures, short detentions, and failed prosecutions marked his relationship with the law. Only after several cycles of violence and public shock, the Sicily massacre, the assassinations of political and judicial figures, the Second Mafia War's bloodshed, did the Italian state adopt the legal and organizational tools that made it possible to target bosses at his level effectively. The introduction of the Mafia Association crime, the development of witness protection for collaborators, the creation of specialized anti-mafia pools, and the confiscation of illicit assets all came after long periods in which Cosa Nostra operated with relative impunity. Seen from the perspective of those who suffered directly from his decisions, however, these advances arrived painfully late. Families devastated by heroin addiction in the United States, shopkeepers and farmers in Sicily who bent under the weight of extortion, and the relatives of those killed in mafia operations, from anonymous foot soldiers to outspoken activists like Giuseppe Impastato, lived for years with the sense that the system was stacked against them. The eventual convictions, especially those that clarified the nature of crimes once obscured or denied, offered a measure of recognition, but could not erase the losses. It is telling that some of the most persistent challenges to the order he represented did not initially come from powerful institutions, but from individuals and small groups acting with limited resources, a young man with a local radio station and a handful of leaflets, a sociologist organizing hunger strikes and public readings in Palermo, families refusing to remain silent about suspicious deaths. Their actions did not by themselves dismantle his power, but they chipped away at the shield of silence that protected it. Over time, they helped create the social conditions in which magistrates and police could act with greater backing and clearer public legitimacy. The contrast between the resources at his disposal in his prime and the conditions of his final decades is stark. As a boss in Sicily and a member of the commission, he wielded considerable informal authority. He could influence who found work, which businesses obtained contracts, and how disputes were resolved. Through his role in heroin trafficking, he participated in decisions that moved enormous sums of money. Yet in the end, those networks did not prevent his arrest abroad or secure him a lighter fate. He died under the same institutional routines as thousands of other inmates in the U.S. federal system, his status reduced to a number on a prison file. His name circulated not as an object of fear, but as an example in legal textbooks and anti-mafia documentaries. If there is a risk in telling his story, it lies in over-personalizing a phenomenon that was, and remains, profoundly structural. Focusing on one boss of bosses can obscure the roles played by lesser-known but essential accomplices. Local politicians who turned a blind eye or actively colluded, business people who accepted rigged contracts and laundered proceeds, ordinary citizens who, out of fear or resignation, paid protection without complaint and repeated the old refrain that nothing will ever change. Badalamenti's rise depended on that ecosystem. His ability to dominate Sicily for so long reflects as much on the weaknesses and compromises of the surrounding society as on his own qualities. That is why contemporary efforts in Sicily and beyond to confront the legacy of Cosa Nostra focus not only on celebrating those who opposed it, but on analyzing the gray areas that allowed it to flourish. Educational programs encourage students to examine how everyday choices, what to report, whom to support in elections, which businesses to patronize, intersect with broader patterns of legality and illegality. Commemorations of victims are increasingly paired with discussions about policy, economics, and civic engagement. In these conversations, the name of Gaetano Badalamenti appears not as a dark legend, but as a case study, a man who exploited specific vulnerabilities in his environment, and whose story illustrates the costs of ignoring such vulnerabilities. Beyond Italy, his trajectory has become part of a wider reflection on how organized crime adapts to global conditions. The mechanisms he used, leveraging diaspora communities, using legitimate fronts like restaurants and trading companies, exploiting gaps between legal systems, are not unique to the Sicilian mafia. Similar patterns can be observed in other criminal organizations across the world. The response that ultimately constrained him: international cooperation, financial tracking, robust witness protection. The targeting of criminal leadership structures offers a template, however imperfect, for addressing those challenges elsewhere. Yet any sense of closure must be tempered by realism. The decline of one boss, or even the weakening of one organization, does not signal the end of organized crime. In Sicily today, Cosa Nostra is considered less dominant than in its peak years, challenged by other criminal networks, and weakened by arrests and defections, but it has not disappeared. New forms of illegality arise in different sectors and regions, often less visible but no less corrosive. Cybercrime, environmental trafficking, corruption in complex procurement systems. The underlying issues that nourished Cosa Nostra: economic inequality, fragile institutions, distrust of distant authorities, persist in many places. In this context, the value of examining the life of someone like Badalamenti lies not in dwelling on his persona, but in understanding the mechanics of his world. How did he use ambiguity between legal and illegal spheres to his advantage? How did he read and influence the fears and aspirations of those around him? How did he maintain a balance between the appetite for profit and the need to avoid excessive visibility until that balance tipped? These are analytical questions with contemporary relevance, extending well beyond the boundaries of one Sicilian town or one criminal group. As the narrative returns one last time to Sicily, the contrast with the past is unmistakable. The airport, once a symbol of a strategic asset under mafia control, now bears the names of two judges murdered by Cosa Nostra, and their portraits hang inside the terminal. The railway line where Impostato's body was found has become a site of annual remembrance marches. Houses that once belonged to mafia families host associations and cooperatives. None of this means that fear has vanished or that all traces of the old order have been erased. But it does indicate that the town is no longer defined primarily by the power of the man who once ruled it from the shadows. The story that began with a child in a poor farming family in the 1920 seconds thus ends with a community and a country that have at great cost begun to free themselves from the grip of the system he served. His name remains in legal records and historical accounts as a reminder of how far things can go when such systems are allowed to grow unchecked. It also serves, indirectly, as a measure of the progress made since his heyday, from an era when bosses rarely face serious consequences to one in which they can be prosecuted across borders and their assets turned to public use. As the final images fade, archival photos of a younger man in a flat cap, grainy courtroom sketches from New York, recent footage of schoolchildren filing into a former mafia property turned community center, the voice of the narrative falls silent. What remains is not a single moral, but a set of intertwined insights. That criminal power thrives where institutions are weak and citizens feel isolated, that dismantling such power requires patience, courage, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and that even the most entrenched figures, like the former boss of Sicily, are not immune to the combined pressure of law, public conscience, and time. In that sense, the life and downfall of Gaetano Badalamenti form not only a chapter in the history of the Sicilian mafia, but a broader warning and a cautious source of hope. A warning that environments like the one that produced him can, if neglected, give rise to similar figures elsewhere. A source of hope that sustained effort, legal, cultural, and civic, can eventually bring even long-protected structures of criminal power into the light, and that communities scarred by their presence can begin, slowly, to write a different story.